The title of this talk is The Kingdom of God is Within You, Diet as an Invocation of Christ. Wasn't intended to be provocative, really. I mean, for people who consider ourselves to be Christians, what that means to us is that to the degree that we can, we emulate Jesus, then I would suggest that we should emulate Jesus in all aspects of our lives, and a part of that is going to be diet. I would like to start by polling the audience with 3 questions. The first question is, in your daily life, when you're going about doing your thing, who here tries to make decisions that are environmentally friendly? So maybe, yeah. So pretty much everybody in the room, I think, raised their hand, which means that perhaps if we're going to the store, it might be more convenient to drive, but we'll walk or we'll ride a bike or something like that. Probably most of us, are attempting to conserve water. We're attempting to conserve electricity. We're making decisions that align with our values as people who care about the environment. Who thinks that if you can make a decision that helps an animal rather than harms an animal, that you've got 2 choices, you should make the decision that helps the animal? Yeah, again, unanimity. And then our third question, who thinks that we should try, where possible, to help people who are in poverty? Yeah, of course. Who's going to say no to that? Who's going to say no to any of those questions? So my contention is going to be that if you raised your hand in response to any of those questions, and I think pretty much everybody raised their hands in response to all of those questions, then the diet that most aligns with the values we already hold is going to be a plant-based diet, a diet that rejects the consumption of animal products. Probably my favorite quote in the Hebrew Scriptures, and a quote that has challenged me since I was about 12 years old, is this one from Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? What does the Lord require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? It seems to me that if we take the idea of acting justly, loving mercy, and walking humbly with God, that has implications for us with regard to our answers to these questions. And I didn't explicitly ask, does your faith command you to make choices that align with your values as an environmentalist? Does your faith command you to make choices that align with your values as somebody who cares about global poverty or cares about animals? But I imagine at Calvin College, for most of you, the motivating factor in your lives is your faith. And it is basically attempting to act justly in our interactions with people, including people who are not near to us, people who are in poverty, people who are suffering in sub-Saharan Africa. When we think about what it means to love mercy, for many of us, that extends beyond human beings and includes animals. When we think about walking humbly, it means to us that where we're making decisions about how we're going to interact in the world, we make decisions that align with our values. And a few of those values are environmentalism, concern for animals, and concern for global poverty. So Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living, like 2,500 years ago. And I think for most of us, certainly for me, where food choices are concerned, I was not leading an examined life. So I grew up in Minnesota my first 12 years, and then Oklahoma is where I went to high school. And the food groups, at least at my high school, were pretty much McDonald's in one box and Dairy Queen in the other box. And you had your McDonald's, Burger King kind of dichotomy, but all the cool kids pretty much ate at McDonald's. That's where I ate, so by definition. And then Dairy Queen for the Dairy Queen Blizzards. And that's pretty much what we ate. And if you had told me in the mid-'80s, if you had said, I don't eat meat or dairy or eggs, I would have looked at you like you had 3 heads. It really would have been an awful lot like, I don't breathe oxygen. What do you mean you don't eat meat? Like, I think it is quite likely that I had, other than maybe occasionally like oatmeal or something for breakfast, even then I was adding, butter and cream. So I think the idea of an entirely plant-based meal, it may not, it certainly wasn't a principal part of probably any meal that I ate in my first 18 years. I got to college in 1987. I considered myself Joe Radical, which, in high school in Oklahoma, Joe Radical means that, like, you've heard of Central America. And I had, in fact, heard of Central America, so I qualified. And I got to college, and I joined a couple of progressive groups. One of them is called Latin American Support Organization. We were working on issues of U.S. policy in Central and South America. Another one of the organizations was called Poverty Action Now. We were organizing fasts for Oxfam America and volunteering at the local soup kitchen in Des Moines. And even back in 1987, the people who were running those two organizations were eating vegan diets. And they were eating vegan diets not for animal protection reasons, not for health reasons. They were eating vegan diets because of concern for the global poor and concern for the environment. And so at Grinnell, you arrive, and probably this happens at Calvin too, for first-year students, you arrive about a week early. So you can sort of figure out, not get lost when you're going to your classes or the library or whatever else, or if you do get lost, you know your way around and you can pretend you're not lost. And so I did that, and I met the people in these other groups, and they gave me this book to read, Diet for a Small Planet. And Diet for a Small Planet is the thing that convinced me in 1987 to adopt a vegan diet. And it has two principal arguments. But the really big argument is that the food system as it exists is broken, and it leads to global poverty because of our desire in developed countries to eat so many animal products. And I think this makes some intuitive sense. If you think about the fact, I weigh about 185 pounds. If I do nothing but lay in bed watching reruns of The Apprentice, I'm going to burn like 2,000 calories a day. Except when the Donald does something I like, and I'm, Donald! Yes, fire her! I get excited. And then my caloric intake ticks up a little bit, right? When I'm cheering him on, all the good stuff he's doing on The Apprentice. That same sort of thing is true for farm animals. Not that they lay in bed watching Donald Trump, in The Apprentice, but that the vast majority of the calories that you feed to a chicken or a pig or a cow, the vast majority of the calories that you feed to a farm animal, the animal expends simply existing. So that it takes about 9 calories into a chicken, which is the most efficient of farm animals. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in terms of that chicken's meat. The other 8 calories the animal expends either existing, just like all of us are eating and not gaining weight, probably. All of what we eat as adults, we expend simply existing. So that's true for animals as we're fattening them up to eat them. And then some of it goes into bones or feathers or blood or something else that we don't eat. So it's essentially 9 calories in, 9 calories in plant matter into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of the animal's flesh. So poll again. Who here likes pasta? I should put some slides up here that get less than full participation. There isn't anybody in here who doesn't like pasta. But regardless of whether you like pasta, if you were eating pasta, who in here would go to your refrigerator, take out 9 plates of pasta, throw them in the trash, and then eat 1 plate of pasta? We're really sort of an all or nothing audience. But no, that's definitely the right answer, right? We all said earlier that we make decisions that align with our belief in ourselves as environmentalists. That would be the opposite of that. And yet that's precisely what we're doing each time we choose to eat chicken. Other animal products are even less efficient. So if we're eating pork or beef or farmed fish, it's even less efficient than 9 calories in for 1 calorie out. And that sort of intuitive understanding and relationship is the thing that turned me vegan in 1987. But it actually is a lot worse than that once you start thinking about the global economic relationship. So this guy is Jean Ziegler, the global envoy on food to the United Nations. And some years back, the Food and Agriculture Organization released their report about where corn and wheat go globally. And they found that 100 million metric tons of corn and wheat was being turned into biofuels. And so Ziegler read the FAO report and called a press conference and declared that biofuels represent a crime against humanity. Because he pointed out, look, we've got about 1 billion people living in nutritional deficit. Billion, it's a euphemism. It means they're not taking in enough calories to sustain basic life functioning. They're starving. So we've got about 1 billion people who are starving. And this use of corn and wheat drives up the price of corn and wheat, and it causes people to be priced out, and it literally leads to starvation, diverting all of this corn and wheat into biofuels. So he said it's a crime. He said it's a crime against humanity. Does that resonate with people? What do you think? Is that a tenable argument? Crime against humanity? Yes. Use the biofuels in that way. Okay. We've got less unanimity. There's some environmentalists who aren't quite sure whether that argument holds up or not. But I will say that regardless of whether that argument holds up, it's worth noting that corn and grain use for farm animals into that extraordinarily inefficient relationship that I was just talking about, 756 million metric tons. That same FAO report found that 100 million metric tons into biofuels, 756 million metric tons into a relationship wherein more than 90% of the calories produced by the grain are basically, flushed down the toilet, essentially. No difference between just throwing it in the trash. And that doesn't even include the 85% of the soy crop that goes to animal feed as well. So 85% of all of the soy that's grown globally is also fed to farm animals. So it's basically more than 10 times as much edible food is cycled through farm animals than goes into biofuels. This is probably the largest banner, world's largest banner. If Guinness gave a world's largest banner, Greenpeace should probably petition for that. A world's largest banner, so that they could then get the prize. But that's a person, that's I think 2 people, that's a person. So it's a massive banner. It's in Brazil. It's a soy crop in Brazil that used to be a rainforest. And because of the soy needs of the chicken and to the pig and to the cattle industries, an awful lot of the rainforests in South America have been chopped down, some of it for grazing, but a lot more of it to grow soy that's then shipped to North America or Europe to be fed to farm animals. And that also means that subsistence farmers are thrown off their land, because it's not just competition for the crops, it's also competition for the land. And the multinational conglomerates come in, they have more money. These subsistence farmers are literally tossed off their land and sent into destitution. So the World Watch Institute puts it this way. They say meat production is an inefficient use of grain. The grain is used more efficiently when consumed directly by humans. Continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the world's poor. In other words, just synopsizing everything that we were just talking about a moment ago. So Gandhi said probably 25 of the most profound things that were ever said. I think that's true, right? You have the 100 most profound things. Gandhi's got 1 through 3, and then. But one of the things he said, and this is actually in the Gandhi Memorial in Delhi. As you're walking into the Gandhi Memorial over the arches, it says, "Think of the face of the poorest person you have ever seen, and ask yourself if the action you contemplate will be of use to that person." Think of the face of the poorest person you've ever seen and ask yourself if the action you contemplate will be of use to that person. So for me, thinking about the story, who is my neighbor, the Good Samaritan story, and thinking about the fact that obviously our neighbor is everybody, right? For my confirmation class when I was like 13 years old in 1982, for my confirmation class we did a skit about global poverty, and that was sort of like my awakening to the fact that there was global poverty, something that had not, that I hadn't been aware of up until that point. And so thinking about our actions in a world where, it's less than 1 billion now, but not a lot less. It's still tens of millions of people dying every year from starvation-related causes. So do we, when we choose to eat animal products, want to be a part of a system that is A, extraordinarily wasteful, and then B, in this global economy, causes us to take part in driving up the price of land and the price of crops, and quite literally being part of a system that causes people to starve? For me, at least, the answer to that question was no. There is a complementary issue in Diet for a Small Planet, and that is the environmental issue. And this one also makes intuitive sense, I think. So it's not just the vast inefficiency of cycling crops through animals. That's not just the entirety of the problem environmentally, although that level of wastefulness is a problem. I mean, how many people here are concerned about food waste? You've read about food waste, yeah, and you think, wow, this is really problematic. Yeah, and we should be, right? That is a legitimate concern for Christians in this world. Food waste is 40%, which is it's just shocking. 40% of what's grown is thrown away. And yet we're in exactly that same sort of relationship if we choose to consume animal products. It's not actually thrown away, but it might as well be thrown away, except it's not 40%, it's 90%. And we're all participating in it if we're choosing to consume animal products. And the ancillary sort of complement to that is that it's not just that basic inefficiency and the environmental consequences of that. It's also all those extra stages of production that are both polluting and energy intensive. So obviously, if we're going to create plant-based foods, that's going to require water, it's going to require land, it's going to require energy. I mean, it's energy intensive and it causes pollution. You have to grow the crops, you have to ship the crops on gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles, to the factory where you turn them into, jujubes or, some fine IPA or some other wonderful vegan food. And that's resource intensive, so it takes a lot of energy, and it's polluting, each stage of that. But if you're going to create animal products, it's many extra stages. You still have to grow the crops, except now you're shipping them to a feed mill. And then you have to operate the feed mill. And then you're shipping the feed to the farm. And you have to operate the farm. At more and more, they're factory farms. Then you have to raise the animals, that's operating the farm, ship the animals to a slaughterhouse, operate a slaughterhouse, ship the meat on refrigeration. So it's about 4 or 5 extra stages of gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles that we become responsible for, as well as multiple additional energy-intensive and vastly polluting factories. The United Nations broke this all down. And so for Christians, we all talked about the environment sort of at the opening of this, but for Christians, I think we all now recognize that the earth is on loan to us. So as Leviticus, as God says in Leviticus, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are but aliens and tenants. And when God is talking about allowing the land to remain fallow every 7th year and every 50th year jubilee, the whole point of all of that is that we are stewards of the earth. And if we actually implemented those biblical prescriptions, we would find the land regenerating itself and the environment being much better off. So we are aliens and tenants, and through animal agriculture, we're doing an awfully bad job as stewards of the earth. So the United Nations a few years back released a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. And in Livestock's Long Shadow, it's over 400 pages, and it dives into the inefficiencies that I was just talking about. And they find that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale, from local to global. So it is literally the case that the inefficiencies that I was just talking about with regard to animal agriculture, no matter what environmental issue you're looking at, from the smallest to the largest, animal agriculture is among the top 3 causes. So more specifically, animal agriculture contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And on the really big environmental sort of could be game over for our species issue, climate change, animal agriculture causes 40% more global warming than all forms of transportation combined. So all of the SUVs, all of the 18-wheelers, all of the jumbo jets, all of the trains, all transportation combined is about 13% of climate change. Animal agriculture is 18% of climate change, so that's about 40% more than that. On a species-by-species basis, this is what it looks like. So you've got legumes. On a calorie of legumes produces about 2 grams of climate change, of CO2 equivalent. Corn is a little bit more polluting, wheat is a little bit more polluting, but look at poultry. On a calorie by, so this is for calories, and this is for calories of protein, so it actually ends up getting worse. And what you find is that chicken, again, the most efficient of the animal products, produces 54 grams of CO2 equivalent for every calorie of chicken, which is 27 times more polluting than legumes. Chicken is 10 times worse for climate change than wheat. It's 14 times worse than corn, and it's 27 times worse than soy and other legumes. And if what you're concerned about is calories of protein, it's actually 40 times worse. So you get 40 times more climate change from a calorie of protein from chicken than from a calorie of protein from soy or other legumes, which are principal substitutes. So the big issue, like most of us when we're thinking about how we're going to decrease our contribution to climate change, for most people, the first thing that we think about is, drive less or change cars, drive a hybrid. And the Sierra Club pointed out that cutting meat consumption by just 1/5, so cutting meat consumption by just 20%, would be the equivalent of switching from a sedan, from a gas guzzler, to a hybrid. And Environmental Defense said that if every American skipped 1 meal of chicken per week, and substituted vegetarian foods instead, the carbon dioxide saving would be the same as taking more than 500,000 cars off US roads. So you think about, for those of us who consider ourselves an environmentalist, we have a chance to prove it every time we sit down to eat. And if you sit down and you choose something that causes 27 times more climate change than something that you could just as easily choose, and it seems to me that that's awfully compromised from a sense of seeing ourselves as stewards of the earth, as seeing ourselves as aliens and tenants who are supposed to be preserving the earth and taking care of it. So those are the 2 reasons I adopted a vegan diet. I did find when I adopted a vegan diet that I got healthier. I was pretty healthy. I was 18 years old, so there's a line in The West Wing where the Surgeon General says to one of the West Wing characters, you could eat crude oil and when you were 20 and your body would deal with it. But I did lose about 10 pounds that I didn't even know that I had to lose. I needed less sleep. I needed less coffee. I'm a really slow runner, but I was running cross country. This is sort of a flashback to Oklahoma as well. What I learned in high school, I'm just not a very good athlete, and so I was playing football and I got cut because in Oklahoma I didn't get cut, but I never got to play. So you show up for the 2-a-days and get pounded at 7 o'clock in the morning, and then you sit on the bench and feel bad about yourself. That's basically what football in Oklahoma looks like if you're not very good at it. But what I discovered is even if you are a horrible runner on cross country, you still get to run, and you get the letter jacket. So you get to go to the mall in your orange letter jacket with the N on it and feel good about yourself. And most people there don't know that you're actually really a pathetically bad runner. But I will say that my running time improved. So I had plateaued with my running time, and it didn't make me competitive. Even at Grinnell College, I still wasn't competitive, which is kind of pathetic. But my running time did drop precipitously. So my 10K time dropped from like 47 minutes sort of standard down to like 42, 43 minutes standard, which is slow. Some of you are looking, suddenly you're like, oh, I'm out of here. No, but it had to do with the fact that I was working with my physiology rather than against my physiology. This is probably the world's worst slide in the history of PowerPoint slides. So you've seen worse? Wow. This is like the personification of death by PowerPoint, I think. But I might get fired if anybody sees this PowerPoint. But it's actually just meant to illustrate a point. This is about, I think this is like 18 things about animal physiology, and that's herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, and human. And what you find is that herbivores have these aspects of their facial muscles and jaw type and jaw joint location, jaw motion. Carnivores have this, omnivores have this, and humans have this. And you can find this online by Googling comparative anatomy of eating, and this chart will pop up. But a couple of them that resonate with me. So another participation portion of our time together. Everybody grab your jaw, please. You don't grab your jaw now, you're going to have to do it for the class. No, I'm just kidding. Move your jaw from left to right. If you can do this, you're a herbivore. Your cat can't do that, right? If you can grind your food, you are not a carnivore and you are not an omnivore. We have about 5 times the hydrochloric acid in our stomachs that natural carnivores and omnivores do, so that we can process, rotting meat. I mean, no, we have 5 times less. They have 5 times more than we yet. They have 5 times the hydrochloric acid that we have, so that they can process rotting flesh in a way that won't kill them. They have a bone teeth density that's many times greater than ours. They have a digestive tract, which is significantly shorter than ours, all of which is designed to process raw flesh. Who here, if you're driving down the road and you see a dead animal on the side of the road, probably we have either the ick reaction, or we have the, oh, sad, animal, died reaction. Does anybody here have the reaction to a carcass on the side of the road? No, right? And our bodies have programmed us to say, if you eat that, it might kill you. Not natural carnivores, not natural omnivores. They stop and they dig in, and it's food. So however long ago we learned, hey, if you cook the bejesus out of this stuff, you are likely to be able to kill the bacteria. And you can process the calories of that flesh into something that you can digest. But it's still not good for us. So the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics looked at all of the science on plant-based diets, on vegetarian and vegan diets, and they published their position paper on that basis. And they point out that vegetarians have lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, and obesity than meat eaters, that vegetarian and vegan diets are appropriate for all life stages, including infancy and pregnancy, and that vegetarian diets have health benefits in the prevention and the treatment of certain diseases. So the biggest killer in the United States is heart disease. It kills about half of men, a little more. It kills almost half of women, and it is completely preventable. Coronary artery, the coronary occlusions are completely preventable, which is more than 95% of heart attacks. And this is a particularly good book that looks at people who were multiple of these people. It's a book by Caldwell Esselstyn, who was a professor and cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic. And the patients that he profiles in this book, Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, multiple of them were told by their doctors that they needed quadruple or quintuple bypass surgery. A few of them were told basically that they should just go home and wait to die. And they ended up getting into his clinical trial, which was published in the American Journal of Cardiology, and then he turned that into this book. And what he found was that even with these people, 100% of whom had advanced stage heart disease, 100% of them put on a low-fat, completely plant-based diet, their arteries literally unclogged. So when the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics say, prevention and treatment of certain diseases, they're talking about the biggest killer in America and the fact that you can actually unclog people's arteries with a low-fat vegan diet. So this is really just a phenomenal book, and I highly recommend it. Its complement is the China study, which is a lot denser. Like, this is stories, prevent and reverse heart disease. Like, he puts the science in there as well, but it's also people's stories. It's people who couldn't walk up a flight of stairs, and they went on a low-fat, completely vegetarian diet and could walk miles as a result. It's people who went from a standard American diet, went on the low-fat, completely plant-based diet, and their cholesterol level went from like 280 to 140 in a couple of months. So it's really, it's interesting, it's riveting, it's fun. And he points out in this book that the American Heart Association diet, people continue to get worse, but more slowly. So he said the AHA diet is sort of like pouring less gasoline on a fire. But it's not pouring water on the fire, which is what he recommends as a better way of putting out the fire. This is a much denser book, the China study. It is tougher to get through, but it makes an extraordinarily strong case using epidemiological and clinical studies that animal protein is the culprit in both heart disease and cancer. So people often would say that it was the saturated fat that was causing heart disease. It turns out it was probably the animal protein that causes heart disease, but since those two things are correlated, you could get the graph, and the graph would track with saturated fat. It also tracks with animal protein. Animal protein, regardless, is the thing that, according to Caldwell Esselstyn, a nutrition professor at Cornell University, is responsible for an awful lot of cancer in society. If you don't want to read these two books, you can watch the movie. The movie is a distillation of these two books. It's called Forks Over Knives, and it is available on Netflix, and it is really quite excellent. And I imagine if you watch Forks Over Knives, you'll end up wanting to read at least Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease, which is really a page-turner. These issues were brought to the attention of this guy, Kim Williams, who is the president of the American College of Cardiologists, and one of his patients brought Prevent and Reverse Heart Disease to him, and he says, I changed that day to a cholesterol-free diet using meat substitutes commonly available in stores and restaurants for protein. Within 6 weeks, my LDL cholesterol level was down to 90. And then he concludes this essay, wouldn't it be a laudable goal of the American College of Cardiology to put ourselves out of business? So, number one killer, and literally reversible with a low-fat, completely plant-based diet. Just last week, the National Academies of Sciences released a report in which they said that premature mortality globally could be cut from 6 to 10% by transitioning toward a plant-based diet. So they have sort of a middle-of-the-road cut back on animal products, eat more plant-based products, and you get to 6%. If the whole population went vegetarian, you get to a little over 8%. If the whole population went completely vegan, you get to 10% cut in premature mortality. It really is the case that the health and nutrition stuff I'm talking about, this is settled science to the same degree that climate change, being human-caused, is settled science. There aren't any reputable bodies that dispute any of the facts about vegetarian diets being healthier than diets that include meat, and vegan diets being healthier still. So for people who consider ourselves, to be temples, there's a preacher in North Carolina who's a vegan advocate, and he goes around and he screams at people and asks them, how are you going to be good evangelicals, if you look like you look slovenly, you look slothful, and he's talking to Southern congregations, not about you are a temple and your body is on loan to you and you should treat the temple well. But if you want to go out and convert the nations, shouldn't you be a vibrant person and not one Big Mac short of a heart attack, like a lot of people in those congregations are. But So that's three ways in which I think that diet, for me at least, is an invocation of Jesus. My concern about the global poor, my concern about the environment, and my concern for my own health as a temple that is owned by God. So I've been vegan for maybe 5 years. As Matt mentioned, after I left college, I went and ran a homeless shelter for families, the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker in Washington, D.C., as well as the largest soup kitchen in Washington, D.C., the Zacchaeus Soup Kitchen. And I had been there probably 4 or 5 years when I came across this book, Christianity and the Rights of Animals, by Andrew Lindsay. It was written in, I think, 1975. So even before Peter Singer wrote Animal Liberation, which is oftentimes considered to be the Bible of the animal rights movement, mildly ironic that a devout atheist wrote the Bible of animal rights, but an actual Oxford theologian and Anglican priest who wrote a book called Christianity and the Rights of Animals. It's not considered to be the Bible, but it really is the Bible. But for people who are taking notes, this is the updated version, and it's actually better than this. This is the book that did it for me, but this book, published in 1995, I think does an even better job of laying out a theology of animal liberation. And in this book, Andrew Lindsay basically, it's basically a liberation theology for animals that posits that animals in our society are the least of these. So there's a lot of Matthew 25 analysis. And it's definitely worth reading for people who are interested in the subject. But I will just point out that in Genesis 1:29, the garden, God creates humans and God creates animals, and he declares both us and animals good. And in Genesis 1:29, God commands what it is that we are to eat, and it's exclusively plants. In the Garden of Eden, human beings are not eating animals, and we're not eating animal products. And if you do a Google image search for the Garden of Eden, you get a lot of images that look like this. And you can't see it very well, but there's, a lion and a gazelle, and there are all kinds of carnivorous animals here, and there are herbivorous animals here, and there are human beings, and everybody is living in harmony. It's a peaceful coexistence. Even the carnivorous animals are not yet eating one another. It's complete nonviolence. And flash forward to the eschaton visions of Isaiah and Micah and Jeremiah. The eschaton visions, it's basically back to the garden, right? The lion is lying down with the lamb. The carnivorous animals go back to the nonviolence of the garden. And it seems to me that for people who are interested in living lives that are in accordance with our faith-based values, we are a fallen people, we are sinful, but to the degree that we can live according to God's ideal, it seems to me that we probably should. There we go. That's Rena. Anybody here willing to eat Rena? My wife would beat you up if you raised your hand in response to eating Rena. But no, of course not. But anybody in here who eats chickens, would be eating somebody who is every bit the individual as Beaky here. I'm guessing nobody in here would be willing to eat chompers. Chomper's cute. But most people, if you're eating pork, would be eating someone in every bit the individual that Fiona here is. And when we think, Jesus gives us one prayer, and it includes the line, "Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And heaven is the eschaton vision. Heaven is the Garden of Eden. We know that there will not be slaughterhouses in heaven. And there really is no difference. All of us, I would imagine that if you asked, for me at least, my faith motivates everything about me. My faith and my ethics are in complete alignment. I get my ethics from my faith. So you ask me, why wouldn't you eat chompers or why wouldn't you eat Rena? And it has a lot to do with my basic opposition to violence. And that would have been true, and to eating individuals. And that would have been true, before I became a vegetarian. It's certainly true now after I'm a vegetarian. But I would make the same argument about not wanting to cause Beaky or Fiona or any other pigs or chickens or other animals to suffer also. And it has in part to do with wanting to live as much as I can the eschaton vision and the Garden of Eden vision. I imagine when I said what's the difference between eating a chicken or a cat, a pig, or a dog, really, I ask that question to people pretty regularly. I have a shirt that says, "Ask me why I'm vegetarian." And people do ask, and I end up in conversations with them. And I often go to sort of my fail-safe is, "Would you eat a dog?" And everybody says no, and I say, "Why not?" And for one, at that point, they're like, "Wait a minute, I asked you the question. How am I suddenly on?" But it's led to some really good conversations, and I know what the common answers are, and it usually has to do with some variation on and a misunderstanding about ethology with regard to animals. Because we don't know farm animals, we consequently don't realize the degree to which they are individuals. But this book, The Inner World of Farm Animals, spells out the degree to which ethologists, so people who study animal emotion, behavior, and cognition, have determined that chickens and pigs, at least, outperform dogs and cats on ethological tests of cognitive and behavioral sophistication. My wife insists that the cats are refusing to do what the scientists want on principle. The cats could destroy the dogs and the pigs and the chickens, but they're above it all. But the dogs are trying. The dogs are all in. And Jane Goodall wrote the introduction, the primatologist Jane Goodall wrote the introduction to The Inner World of Farm Animals, and she pointed out that farm animals feel pleasure and sadness, excitement and resentment, depression, fear, and pain, just like we all know our dogs and cats do, so too farm animals. They are far more intelligent than we ever imagined. They are individuals in their own right. So the most abused farm animals are chickens and fish, aquaculture. So I'm just going to, a couple of things about chickens specifically, and this is Beaky again. This woman literally wrote the book on chicken ethology. It's called Brain and Behavior in the Chicken. Academics could do better with their book titles, I think. I bet she would have sold more copies if she'd invoked Chicken Little or I don't know, something. But in any event, on the basis of the research that exists, she writes, "It is now clear that birds," and she's writing about chickens, hence the book title, "have cognitive capacities equivalent to those of mammals and even primates." One particular piece of research at the University of Bristol, they taught chickens to delay gratification. So they taught the chickens that they could either get some food now or they could get more food later. And they taught the chickens to do this fairly quickly. They've also taught chickens to learn from watching television. The chickens can play tic-tac-toe, as most people probably know from the fact that they do it in Vegas. But Discovery Magazine reported on the Bristol research, the delayed gratification research. They said chickens do not just live in the present, but can anticipate the future and demonstrate self-control, something previously attributed only to humans and other primates, not even to monkeys. And this really is, this doesn't mean that chickens are smarter than elephants and dolphins. And what it really means is that ethology is in its infancy, but chickens were the first species that ethologists were able to discover self-control in that species. They are, if you spend any time on a farm sanctuary, you learn that chickens are individuals just like dogs or cats are individuals. So unfortunately, the argument against eating animal products from a faith standpoint is stronger than simply for the same reason you wouldn't eat a dog or a cat, don't eat a chicken or a pig. It's stronger than just the sort of more highfalutin philosophical argument against eating animals on nonviolence grounds. The way that these animals are treated is abysmal. And everybody in here at the beginning of our discussion said that if you can make a decision that helps animals or harms animals, we had unanimity, you go with helps animals. So even outside the basic issue of eating individuals, We are also participating in a relationship when we eat animals that denies God by treating God's creatures so abysmally. This is how more than 99% of chicken gets to the table. In the United States, we eat about 8.5 billion chickens, 300 million turkeys, 100 million pigs, and about 35 million cattle. So we eat about 250 times as many chickens as cows. We eat about 100 times as many chickens as pigs. And they are the most intensively confined. Of those 8.5 billion animals, more than 99% of them live like this. It is a carpet of chickens. A chicken has a wingspan of about 30 to 32 inches. In these sheds, each chicken gets about 9 by 9 inches, which isn't enough to even spread one wing. And you walk into one of these places and the ammonia levels will just like knock you over. They are horrific. This is a chart from the Wall Street Journal 2 days ago. The front page of the Wall Street Journal had an article about the fact that chickens are growing so quickly that it's making them less tasty. Oh, it's very sad for those people who want to eat chicken. They're less tasty because the animals are growing more quickly. What this shows is that chickens, they were a little over 2 pounds in the 30s. Now they're 6.24 pounds, except that this was about 4 months of growth. This is about 40 days of growth. So the chickens that are sold in the cafeteria here or the grocery store or restaurants, they are literally baby chickens. But you walk into one of these sheds and they're peeping like babies, but they're these sort of crazy Frankenstein animals who, as this Wall Street Journal chart points out, they now grow from, they in the 1930s, it would take about 45 days to put on a pound. Now it takes 7.7 days to put on a pound. So that's almost 6 times as fast. Their upper bodies are growing. Poultry researchers at the University of Arkansas said that if human beings grew as quickly as modern broiler chickens, by the time they were 6 months old, they would weigh almost 700 pounds. I mean, think about that. A 6-month-old human baby at almost 700 pounds. Just like that human baby, the chicken's organs can't keep up. Their limbs can't keep up. So they suffer from massive rates of lung collapse or heart failure or crippling leg deformities as a result of this, these awful, awful conditions. So we have taken animals who give glory to God, and we've basically played, well, not even played God, we're playing Satan with them, turning them into automatons and denying them everything that's natural to them, that God designed them to be and to do, and tormenting them in the practice, in addition. I have one gruesome photo. It's this one. And this photo and this quote, I'll actually read you the quote before I talk about it. This guy, Stan Painter, is a veterinarian. He's a USDA inspector. This quote was on the front page of the Washington Post about 18 months ago when they were writing about chicken slaughter. And he says, workers are literally throwing birds into the shackles, often breaking their legs as they do it. They're working so fast, they sometimes get one leg in the shackles. When that happens, the chickens aren't hanging right. They don't get killed, and they go into the scald tank alive. And they're literally burned to death. Although I would say everything up until the point at which they go into the scald tank alive is pretty awful to begin with. And the reason for this is that in the United States, well, one of the reasons for this is that in the United States, the USDA, in its wisdom, refuses to grant any kind of humane slaughter protection to birds. So what this means is that all of the birds are treated absolutely abysmally. They're treated in ways, they're slaughtered in ways that would be illegal in Europe if slaughterhouses in Europe operated in the same way that slaughterhouses in the United States operate. So Alice Walker calls eating chickens eating misery, which I think is right. And when we're sitting down to eat and we're making a decision about what we're going to consume, do we want to support misery or mercy, right? Compassion or cruelty? For people of faith, for people who want our diets to be Christian invocation, I hope we're going with mercy and with compassion. The most underrepresented animals are fish. This is commercial fishing. These are all mouths. So this is probably hundreds of thousands of fish in this net. And the fish that are not crushed to death in the middle will be poured out of these nets. And you can see all of this. Google video, it's remarkable. You can see the chickens, you can see exactly what Stan Painter is talking about by just Google videoing chicken slaughterhouse or YouTubing chicken slaughterhouse. You can see this by Google videoing commercial fishing. The fish are poured out onto the deck. Workers slice them in half, still completely conscious, and toss them into freezers. That's how they die. This is fish farming, which is actually the one form of animal product consumption that's even worse than this, is fish farming. That's largely a factor of the fact that it goes on for so much longer. It's basically the in-water equivalent of this, except that instead of going for like 40 days, it goes for almost 2 years that fish are in these just hideous conditions. And although fish do their thing underwater, and although fish can't scream out, biologically and physiologically, fish feel pain in the exact same way and to the exact same degree as mammals and birds. They suffer in the same way physiologically in these conditions that you or I would suffer in these conditions. The foremost living marine biologist is Sylvia Earle. She says, "I never eat anyone I know personally. I wouldn't deliberately eat a grouper any more than I'd eat a Cocker Spaniel. Fish are so good-natured. They're so curious. Fish are sensitive. They have personalities. They hurt when they're wounded." And if you Google fish sentience, if you Google fish ethology, you find an awful lot of really interesting research about fish having long-term memories, fish recognizing other fish. People who have companion fish talk about being able to train them. So they do their thing underwater, but they are individuals like dogs and cats and chickens and pigs are individuals. So whether you're taking Proverbs 12:10, the righteous person has concern for the welfare of his or her animals, or if you're going sort of 10,000 feet instead of so on the ground, and you're thinking about Jesus, the one prayer Jesus gives us on earth as it is in heaven, it seems to me this is a fourth way in which our diet can be an invocation of Christ. Back to the Micah quote. What does the Lord require of us but that we act justly, that we love mercy, and that we walk humbly? I would contend that in all four of these areas, choosing to consume animal products, it's bad for the global poor, it's bad for the environment, it's bad for animals, and it's bad for us to boot, which strikes me as either gluttony or awfully darn close to gluttony. The affirmative way of looking at all this is St. Paul says, and one of the this is sort of a negative view. Look at all the harm that animal products cause. But there's also the extraordinarily positive and exciting and fun and cool way of looking at it. And that is, the thing we do second to sleeping is eating. We can turn our diet into prayer. This is every time we sit down to eat, we make a decision about who we want to be in the world. Do we want to alleviate global poverty or support it? Do we want to help animals or harm them? Do we want to tread lightly on the earth, or do we want to stomp over the earth with combat boots? Do we want to make decisions that are good for us physiologically or bad for us physiologically? So, Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. Most of us don't think when we sit down to eat about what went into what it is that we're choosing to consume. But once we start diving into it, there's an awful lot to think about. And by choosing plant-based foods, we make our diet an invocation of Christ, and we take Paul seriously when he tells us to pray without ceasing. The last thing I want to talk about is just a little sort of historical reflection. I'm amazed that there's a photo of this. Headquarters, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. There's a photo of this. This is not that long ago. And I think it's humbling to think about the fact that, as a sort of world and society, we got around to banning slavery in 1865. That's 151 years ago that we passed the 13th Amendment. We got around to giving women the right to vote nationally in 1920, so 96 years ago. Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living 2,500 years ago. And for 2,350 years after that, there was this assumption that one acceptable way for human beings to interact with one another was for some of us to hold others of us as slaves. For 2,400 years after Socrates said that, it was acceptable that women were not given a say in governance. And there was a spirited debate in Congress in 1918, 1920 about whether the Union would dissolve if these irrational creatures, more than half of y'all, would the Union dissolve if you all were given a say in governance? That is historically a finger snap ago. But as Peter Singer says at the very beginning of the book Animal Liberation, he says the challenge for us is not to say, what were our ancestors doing that was, morally compromised. It's not to say, look at those moral reprobates who held other human beings as slaves. Look at those moral reprobates who denied women the vote, right? The challenge is to say, what are we doing now that future generations are going to look back on with that same sort of moral opprobrium? I'm convinced that it's the vast inefficiency, the huge pollution, the climate change, and the cruelty that we engage in, all of this stuff, when we make the bad decision to cycle crops through animals and then to eat those animals. And so my hope for all of you, if you came in here as somebody who consumes meat, please think about all of the issues that I just raised, and think about either cutting it out or cutting it back. If you're cutting it back, a really good way to start is to stop eating chickens and turkeys and fish. That is a fantastic first step. See what you think about it and see if you can cut back more. If you became a vegetarian but not yet a vegan, think about cutting back, especially your egg consumption, but really both, because everything that I just talked about is equally true of dairy and eggs. And if you came in a vegan, raise the issues with these issues with your faith community. Host vegan potlucks, bring in vegan speakers, work with Matt. And together, we can create a world where more and more people are realizing their diet as an invocation of Jesus. Thank you.